Welcome back to the CxO Cast, an open conversation about leadership in scaling technology businesses. In this episode, Rory and I discuss how humility and ego impact leadership style, and how to strike a balance between visionary leadership and open-mindedness to sometimes, just sometimes, being wrong. If you enjoy this episode, consider subscribing to be notified whenever another episode comes out, and drop us a question or a comment below.
We've got to find a way to actually introduce you.
Yeah, but okay, fine. Okay, maybe a good way to introduce me is to think about the point where I joined the journey, which is when you guys moved from a small team. You know, it was you, the 4 founders. You were probably actually a little bit bigger when I joined because I think you were about 20 people.
So our Series A, probably 20, 25, something like that. Yeah.
And we had spent a lot of time looking at open source software and specifically the kind of leading indicators of future commercialization of open source projects. And what we could see very clearly is in this API management space, it was developing quickly, going into this kind of 3rd generation of products. There were some very highly funded businesses that had open source metrics that were not dramatically different from Gravity's as a kind of European kind of small team that had raised at that point next to no venture capital. In fact, I think no venture capital. And so we kind of aligned quite quickly on the opportunity to invest some capital, scale up that business, drive the commercialization, and kind of move some of that open source traction that the product had into commercialization. So that was when I joined. I'm an investor with a venture capital fund called Ox. We invest in B2B software businesses in Europe, like Gravity, and help them scale, help those teams scale globally. I think
How did you get into Ox? How did you get into the world of VCs?
So most of my career has been spent working with technology businesses on financing and M&A, so kind of acquiring other technology businesses. I think the opportunity I find the space fascinating. I think.
Well, you're doing a master's.
I'm doing a master's in computer science at the moment. Yeah. If I ever manage to complete it, I will tell you. But yeah, I've always found the space fascinating, and I think obviously those are the businesses that have some of the most dramatic challenges to face because you can raise. I mean, certainly in the last couple of years, it's been relatively easy to raise large amounts of venture capital, but then you need to translate that into a sustainable business. And I think we've seen a lot of examples of, I guess, what people in kind of the tech press call kind of growth at all costs mindset.
Right.
But actually kind of building a sustainable long-term business of size and of quality is a really, really challenging thing to do. And I think, you have some industries, take, for example, mining, where you have, a very capital intensive core asset, and you might have the price of your product determined by some exogenous factors in the market that you don't control, but you kind of know what you're doing. That market is established, you know who your buyers are, you know who your sellers are. But working with businesses where, often they're still trying to establish a go-to-market model for the first time. What is it that works for us? Is it inbound-led, inbound driving content marketing? Is it a community adoption model? Is it outbound sales? These experimenting around those questions and finding what can drive kind of really explosive growth is something that I find really exciting. And so, joined Ox 5 years ago, moved out to Sweden.
Yeah.
Love Sweden for about 3 months a year when they put the lights on. The rest of the time it's a bit dark. No, it's good.
Stockholm's an awesome city.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Very cool. Very cool.
And
Well, we're lucky to have you on board.
Thank you for having me on board. I feel very lucky to have joined the journey, and I think particularly in relation to what you said about transparency and trust. I think if I look, at the range of different businesses that we see across Europe, one of the things that marks you and the team out as kind of leaders in an area, specifically in addition to having a great product and great growth, is how you build. The CEO quality is questionable, but outside of the CEO, you've really built kind of data and transparency into the business. Every time we're catching up, whether it's kind of weekly, monthly, whatever it is, all of the information that you use to run the business is available to us as investors, and that creates an
Also,
environment.
to all the staff.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. At all levels?
Yeah.
Or? Oh, wow.
Every single person in the organisation has access to all the dashboards.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean that's fantastic and very unusual. And I think what it shows is a commitment to that transparency and trust that makes it fundamentally much easier for us to work on the impactful things on the investor side, because we know, very quickly kind of where the challenges are, where we can be impactful solving them. And I think it speaks to what you were saying earlier around kind of transparency and trust, because I think one of the difficult things as a C-suite leader is having that relationship with your board, with your investors who may not be on the board, where you feel that you can be transparent enough about where the challenges are without feeling some sense of kind of personal attack and some kind of failure of judgment on your behalf. That's quite a kind of psychologically vulnerable position to put yourself in.
Yeah.
But you and the team do it, and you have done it throughout the whole period that we've worked together, which is differentiating.
Well, I think we're lucky though. I would say that it's.
Just the numbers are so good, you can share them anyway.
No, I mean, even if they weren't good, I still believe in. I get that intellectual honesty point. I think that's a really important point, because before doing this job, or even probably when I started my own company previously, when I was sleeping on my mum's sofa, all that sort of stuff, I've always been a big believer in that sort of that real sense of openness, because I think that you as an individual will never. I think it's seldom that you will come up with the right answers all the time. It's very, very rare, and I think that is one of the things that I do notice typically in not just founders, but founders. I'm not talking about our founders, I should point out, because they're actually incredibly good with this sort of stuff. But I do notice in other businesses, founders and people who are senior, is that trying to get that balance right between the vulnerability point and being able to be wrong. Actually, it's really hard. I know, because it sounds sort of easy, and it sounds like the sort of thing that's a very modern thing to sort of say, like, oh, you've got to be, you can fail, and you can be wrong. But actually being wrong and knowing how to respond to that is really difficult. It's really difficult. Particularly, let's be honest about it, the people who tend to find themselves in positions of leadership probably are, I would guess that there is probably a fairly decent relationship between, I don't know the word, like their ego, let's say, and and their position of seniority within a business, and that is a very difficult balance.
Yeah, I think in ego, not necessarily in a negative sense, but yeah, people will be self-selecting in terms of kind of becoming founders because they feel that they've spotted an opportunity that others haven't, that they could capitalize on in a way that others haven't.
Yeah.
So there is a sense in which I think kind of, okay, I've spotted something, I've seen this, and therefore I am right about it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the balance. Is at some point you're not always going to be right. You may be like their conviction about the market and stuff like that. And by the way, I'm not anti-founder or anything like that. I think if it sounds that way, but the key thing is that you're right. Like the conviction, the initial thesis behind which you created the product or business or whatever it may be, absolutely. But at some point, you need to, like, the way I remember this when I worked in smaller businesses before I started my own business, even before Lloyd's, for example, was that what I started to learn and looking at stuff was that at some point, the business and the human diverges. When you're like 15 people, 10 people, your organization, the values, and this is why I say in the very early days, your values and that of the founders or people like that is typically very well closely aligned. So defining your values through a big exercise of saying, oh, we believe in blah. I'm not convinced it's a great use of time. But the key thing is at some point it diverges, and you have to realize that the company is not you. You are not the company is not you. And that your job is as a steward for the company. And you have to, that sounds very preachy actually. I'm not saying that other people should believe this. This is my belief. But my belief is that it is your role as the CEO to do what is right for the company, even if it's not the right thing for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that I find that it's very easy as the CEO, and not just CEO, but people in a position of power, whether in a company or not, to lose sight of those very basic fundamental things.
Yeah. In organizations where your sense of personal capital might be really important to your life within that organization, you think, okay, if I make this decision and I'm seen to be wrong, I lose personal capital, I lose influence, and
it's a tricky one. I mean, how did you find that when you were, a CFO, and even now in terms of as a partner in the organization?
So on the operating side, the business I joined was in initially kind of quite a challenging position.
Yeah.
And I think there had clearly been quite kind of siloed thinking of the type that we've just discussed, where people had kind of domains.
Right.
And the founder team was super strong and was super well aligned, but outside of the founder team, some of the people who had been brought in kind of had domains for which they were responsible, and there were definitely kind of things that were swept under the rug. And my kind of focus when I came in was to kind of lift the rug and just kind of get everything out in the open.
Right.
And that first 2-3 months of going through that process was really challenging. And I think one of the things, maybe we can kind of come on to talk a little bit about your experience of this, but one of the things I had to do quite early was focus on downsizing and kind of reducing headcount.
Yeah.
I guess that's a difficult thing for any leader to do, particularly in a situation that I was in, where you're doing it under quite a lot of time pressure.
Right. Yeah, that's tough.
I think a lot of organizations in our sector are going through that experience now.
Yeah.
I guess maybe what's your experience of that? Because I think, there will have been a point in Gravity where you had to let someone go for the first time.
Sure.
And that won't have been the last time.
Yeah.
How do you kind of think through that process as a CEO?
Well, again, it tends to be something that I share with the management team. So the way that we do it at Gravity, and I'm not saying that this is how every organizer, but I essentially created a fairly robust structure that that the management team themselves have to go through. So as soon as either there is a risk of somebody leaving, for example, or either through their choice or through ours, they have to come and speak to the management team about it. The management team discusses it, basically, every single person. Now, it's very different. This is I would say that we are obviously a 100-person company. If you're a 5,000-person company, and the challenge that fundamentally organizations in our sector, let's say the tech sector, is facing at the moment, can you manage in that way? Maybe, maybe not. But the key thing from our perspective is how we deal with it as an organization is that we would always debate that and discuss that as a management team. And again, I don't want to sound too sort of, broken, like a broken record, but a lot of it does come back to being able to be open and be wrong about stuff, actually. Because I might say, hey, I think we should, this person isn't for me. I think we should do something about it. But other people in the organisation, in the management team, might come back and say, I'm not sure I agree with you on it. And it's the ability to have that foundation of trust to be able to actually say, okay, well, I trust their perspective on it, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong on this. And I think there is strength in being able to do that as well. It's not always necessarily a weakness, but we could get into the sort of challenges of the market in terms of this space at the moment and large scale downsizing, because that approach would be a bit different, probably, almost certainly, if you're having to do large scale downsizing.
Yeah, in businesses like Facebook and Twitter and Microsoft, where they're laying tens of thousands.
That's hard.
Yeah.
That's a hard process. Typically, it sounds easy, but typically I would try to avoid getting yourself into a situation where you're going to have to do that in the first place.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by that is, in my view, and people can disagree with this entirely, but in my view, the characterization of what I've seen in this market at the moment is I remember this as a student as well when I was younger. Is the market is largely like sheep. Like people will, and I don't mean the people of the market. I mean that the characteristics of how the market works. As soon as a threshold of people start moving, the whole market starts moving. That's what the market fundamentally is. And the problem is that a lot of people raised money on very good valuations, on high multiples in the good times, so to speak. And the problem is that as soon as your valuation, your multiples are not there, like people have to remember, a tech business, probably, I don't know, 70%, 60 to 70% plus of the cost base is associated with people, if not more. It's typically not locked up in offices, in things like in
kind of warehouses,
factories, and like a lathe or something like that. Like it's not like they've got widgets being made or something like that. These are people building software, developing software. So typically it's a very high gross margin business because of it and things of that nature. And the problem is that when you go and raise money at a very good valuation, and by the way, I don't look at people negatively at all for raising money on a very good valuation, because they have no choice at that. Well, it's very difficult. It's easy for us sitting here now going, they shouldn't have raised money at that valuation, should they? But the market dictates what they want the business to look like. If your business does not look like this thing, whatever that thing is, you will struggle to raise money. And so at the moment, the market is indexing on things like your what's it called? Your
cash burn multiples.
Cash burn, your efficiency, broadly speaking, let's say. Whereas in the past, it was all about growth at all cost mindset, all that sort of stuff. So it had to be, you had to be 100% plus growth, 150% was, the good stuff and all that sort of thing. But the problem is that in order to try and achieve those, you have to invest very heavily in your organization, in the headcount and staffing, in all your different parts of the organization, maybe to build new products, maybe to be able to have people in your go-to-market part of the organization. So you're creating a whole, your business is structured around that whole premise of growth. And it's dictated to largely, not dictated to, but it's largely directed because the market is saying this is what we want to see at the moment.
Yeah.
And so the problem is when the good times turn and suddenly your valuations aren't good and you therefore need to be able to get through the window until you get back to the sort of good times or normal times, what do you have to do? You have to be able to reduce your cost base to increase your runway. And what that means is if 70, 60% of your cost base is people associated, you struggle with that a lot.
Yeah.
And so we were in the fortunate position, I would say, in that we never trained the business to expect multiples of like 15, 20, 25, 30, some of the crazy multiples that are being paid out. We did all of ours on a 10, 11, 12 X multiple. Now people might go, well, that's a bad job you did back there. You could have got this at like 15, 20, and they're probably right. I'm a horrendous negotiator. But
we're going to bleep all of this section out.
Really? This is gold dust. Let's get Last of the Summer Wine back in. But look, I mean, it's not easy. Letting people go is never easy. And I think we've got another session probably coming out, another sort of, episode, I think 7 in the series, of us jabbering on about something else. But in all seriousness, I think we probably need to cover that one in a bit more detail because it's a very complex subject.
So generalizing it then, I mean, I've definitely spent time working with CEOs who have struggled to find balance and who have kind of risked burning out at points. Have you, what are your kind of personal strategies for dealing with that? To just, even if all of kind of work, life, other things are kind of integrated, having some strategies just to stay sane when things get very busy and very intense.
Look, from my perspective, I like those periods. If I don't have those periods, I actually get bored. So I tend to quite like the periods where it's back against the wall, sort of like, right, now you got to fight. Now you've got to knuckle down and really work out how you get out of this and work out how you deal with. I like those sorts of situations to an extent. But you're right. There are times, like there are days that you go through for sure. I could think of one last week. You just go through periods like I've started to notice myself that I don't know if it's a mental health thing, but days when you're just not thinking about stuff in this. You don't think. I don't know why. You maybe just don't view them through the same positive lens that you might do otherwise. And I don't really know why. And those sorts of situations, you just have to, like, the thing I always I think I've learned by now is that you're going to have them. But you're going to have days that are good as well.
What about other members of the team who maybe kind of don't find those periods of stress quite so energizing? I mean, humans. So there's a range of personalities on the human spectrum. How do you kind of work with those people to make sure that they can still achieve despite that intensity?
This is a very interesting point, actually, because it comes back to the makeup of the team and stuff like that, and about interviewing and things like some of the questions that we spoke about earlier. But I'll be honest, from a management team perspective, I expect a lot of people, and I need them to have that level of resilience. Doesn't mean that they have to have it all of the time, but I do expect that if they're on a beach somewhere or if they're wherever they are, the business is one of the most important things in their life, and I do expect them to be partially on, not to be completely off at certain points. I'm sure that a lot of people are like, oh my God, massive red cross, you should never ever do this as like a manager or something. As general staff, I 100% agree with that. They should be able to switch off. Not everybody should be held to those standards. But in a business at this stage, just being honest about it, my expectation is that you have to fight incredibly hard to be able to do. So you referenced earlier about how it's difficult to do things like go-to-market strategy and all these sorts of things. There are a multitude of things that you have to be able to do to get right. It's a bit like life on Earth to something. I mean, it's not quite as complex as that, but the probability that the stars really do have to align. There's a lot of luck fundamentally, actually, that you're in the right place at the right time. But if you're in the right place at the right time, it is really incumbent upon you and the management team that you not entirely dedicate yourself to it, because you do need to have aspects out. It's unhealthy to have everything dedicated to business, but you have to really give yourself to the business, and that's what I expect those people of the management team. So, what I would say is that they do, just to be clear, a lot of the management team will go and just completely disconnect. Completely, I do not. I just do not completely disconnect. It doesn't work that way. If my disconnecting is taking time to think about the business, it gives me the space to think about the business. So, for example, when I was on holiday in Greece last year, my disconnecting was building dashboards for the business. Yeah. My wife absolutely loved this. This was gold dust for her, but she detested it. But that was the opportunity for me to reflect, and to read books about about organisations and stuff like this. And so, but I do think that there is a healthy balance. I would say mine is probably, for me, I find it healthy because that's how I work. But it wouldn't be healthy for probably 99% of other people. And so the key thing is, again, just listening to people, understanding their perspective on stuff. But
I think what you said about luck is very true. I mean, we work with a lot of scaling businesses, and I mean, just probabilistically, the chance that the business you're working with will become, $1 billion business is very, very small.
Yes.
But, and this is something I share with my colleagues, luck is probabilistic. You are more likely to be lucky if you kind of show up more than the other people.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I think that there is a kind of probabilistic aspect to just being serendipitous.
Well, what did they always say about? I think in economists always said luck. What the definition of luck was, the intersection between, I think it was, I can't actually remember the statement, so this is not going to go down well. But I think it was.
Let me just quote. Actually, I don't know.
Let me quote Friedman. I think it was like the intersection between, I think, hard work and something else. We'll look it up. We'll put it on a link somewhere.
You've decided to focus on one aspect of that equation. You were like, I can't remember what the other bit is. I'll just do the hard work, and maybe maybe it'll work.
Forget the other bit. It doesn't exist. But how do you? It's interesting. Like, how do you genuinely find that? Because I would say that I would accept that I would probably say that I'm in the abnormal category, or abnormal is probably a strong term. Let's say I'm in the I'm an outlier, maybe, when it comes to the how on you are within a business and stuff like that. How do you find it?
I think I recognise a lot of what you say about finding that gives you energy. Yeah. Because actually, I don't find that switching off completely gives me energy.
Yeah.
I find it actually kind of slightly stressful. Yeah. It's just because then I'm kind of wondering what is happening, what I'm not kind of paying attention to. But I also think for me, it's nature, like access to nature.
Yeah.
I find that if I'm not able to be outside, and particularly outside of a city regularly, that's when I start to kind of lose my mind. Now, I can be in nature on my phone, kind of sending emails if I need to be, but I need that access to the natural world.
Yeah, I agree with that. That was why we moved out of London, actually. Specifically, it wasn't just that reason. It was right at the beginning of lockdown. In actual fact, we didn't do it because of lockdown. But I do agree with you. Like the day last week, for example, where it was tough, I intentionally got up very early the next morning and went for a run with the dog.
Yeah.
And we live in a sort of very hilly part of the countryside, about an hour away from London, and you can, you just go and see the horses, you just go and, see the sun rising and all that sort of stuff, and you get lovely views. And I do think that is, I would agree with you, it's not for everyone, but for me, it's definitely grounding in that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I had a kind of challenging experience a couple of weeks ago where something that I was working on for a period of time kind of didn't come to fruition, and that happens a lot. And you have to be resilient to some extent, but obviously there's a feeling of disappointment. But then when you see the dog just kind of tear apart a child snowman in the park, that just brings the joy back.
It really brings a joy to the heart. That
exactly.
Sort of,
I was just like,
I didn't know where that was going. I'm pleased it ended with snowman.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on the CxO Cast. We hope you enjoyed the episode and gained some insights into the world of leadership in scaling technology companies. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, please subscribe and follow us on your preferred platform. Whether you're a founder, a CxO, or just an interested listener, we'd love to hear back from you, so do reach out to us through our social media channels. Until next time, keep scaling. This is the CxO Cast.